All right, in the last video, I said that you couldn't put primitive types in an array list. You can only put objects into an array list. And just to prove that, let's look at this part of the code right now. I have an array list, and what I'm trying to do is declare it as containing ints, right? Primitive type ints. And you can see it's squiggled here. And so this code is not even going to compile, right? But what we can do is put in integer objects with a capital I, and now my code is just fine. And so, what is an integer object? Well, let's go back to Google here, and I'm on the integer object documentation, and it says an object of type integer contains a field whose type is int. It contains a single field. And we can even look down at the constructor for this, and there's a constructor that takes a single int value as its argument. So, it's probably pretty clear that if you saw the code for the integer class, there is a private int value as one of its fields. And I bet the one line of code in here is something along the lines of this dot value equals value. All right. So now, the next question is, it's like, wait a minute. It looks like I'm just adding regular ints in. And actually, I'm not. I'm actually adding integer objects into my nums list, and there's just some code happening here that's implicit and you're not seeing it. So before we look at what's happening in the array list, let's go up here. So I'm going to uncomment this line of code. Okay, this first one. So I've got integer x equals 5, and it looks like it's going to compile just fine. The little yellow squiggle is just a warning. It's just telling me that, hey, you're not using the value x for anything. Do you really need this code here? But one thing that we could say is happening here is that we're doing new integer 5, integer, right, new integer 5. And now this code is going to compile fine. Now this strike through is there for another reason. Okay, we'll talk about that in a second. But the code compiles. So when I ran this code, what actually happened is I created a new integer object. I passed the 5 in. Right, the 5 got passed in for the value. And then we stored that in the object, right, x. But we don't even need to do that because Python has this feature called auto boxing, which when you try to take an int and store it into an integer object, right, it will create the integer object for you. Now, just kind of this is just something that's happened in the last few years in Java. It says that the integer constructor is deprecated, and because it's rarely appropriate to use it. All right, and what actually happens, and I don't know the reason for this, but there's a function called value of that takes an int, and the implied code here is actually going to be integer, like the class integer, and value of 5. Right, and now I'm not getting the strike through on here. So it, from our perspective, it functions the same, but this is what actually is happening. And this value of function returns an integer object. And so this is returning an integer object with 5 as its field, and it stores it there. All right, so this is one of those situations where, this is what's happening, but they only make us type that because I think it's because one of those things that you're going to want to do so often, they're just giving us a shorthand to make it easier. Now, the other thing that happens, I remember that x is an integer object, and now we're trying to add it to a primitive, which doesn't really make sense when you want to add an object to a primitive type. But there's some more implied code here. And so there's a function in here that's called int value, which returns the value of the integer as an int. So, so X is actually an object, right? But it's int value, and that's what's getting called. And then I get my yellow squiggle here because I'm not using the sum for anything. So let's print it out, and so now my code should get me, right? So there's the 9, which is the sum of the value 5 and 4, right? So, so this is code that illustrates what's actually happening, inside, under the hood here, so to speak. But all we actually need to type is that because of this feature called auto boxing, and then here we don't have to call the int value function on it because of a feature called auto unboxing. So, and these features are really just for conveniences. And we've seen something like this before. Remember, we typically construct a string like this, where you do string str equals, and you just put the stuff in quotes. But what really happened here, and this is also valid Java, is to call the constructor for a string object and pass the string as an argument. But the thing is, when you're programming, you deal with strings so much that you just don't really, it's just a convenience not to have to type all that stuff, right? So implicit code happens in quite a few places in Java. All right, so let me comment this out again just so we don't have to think about it. Now let's go back down here and look at this array list that I made. So when I did this array list integer, right, I put this here because array lists can only hold objects, and it's actually very easy for me to add integer objects because all I have to do is type in the little int, but what we should just be aware is what really happened is we went to the integer class and we did value of 1, and then right. So this is what actually happened, even though we only to put in the values 1, 2, and 3, right? So that's another instance where auto boxing is taking place. And then down here, right, each time I go for int n in nums is integers, whereas n is an int. So every iteration of this loop, when n is pulled out, an auto unboxing is taking place, and that int value method is getting called, and that's why we can treat it as though it were a list of int values, right? And so, right. So again, right, 1, 2, 3. We're taking advantage of auto boxing here, and we'll take advantage of auto unboxing here. Now, you might wonder, it's like, well, what about other primitive types? If I for some reason have a need to use an array list or some other list structure to store primitive types such as doubles or booleans, well, in Java, here I am on the integer class. Every single primitive class has its own wrapper class. And so here, an object of Boolean contains a single field whose type is Boolean, and you can look at the constructor, right? And it obviously saves that. Same thing, you really don't ever need to use it because the auto boxing and unboxing will take care of it for you. And here's the double class and the character class. And there's a handful of other primitive types, all right, as well. So, just want you to be aware that it is true that array lists can only hold objects, but in practice, there are a lot of situations where we get to act as though they're holding primitive types, and the notation is reasonably simple for doing so because of the features auto boxing and auto unboxing. All right, hope that makes sense. Let me know if you have any questions.